Sometimes spells in Clash of Clans don't look or work as intended, and this often causes some hilarious and game-breaking moments. Today, I thought it would be fun to look at a bug or glitch that has happened to every spell in the game. I mean, I did one for troops and buildings, and so this seemed like the most natural follow-up.
Let's do this.
Let's start with the jump spell, where in mid-2015, troops would not jump. You literally had one job. Yeah, you drop a jump spell, and instead of the troops jumping over the walls as intended, they would completely ignore it and start attacking the walls in the way. If only we could get these walls out of the way so we can use the jump spell. Other times, the jump spell was working normally at first, but then suddenly stopped, like someone flipped some kind of off switch. The troops would walk in place, and then the effects would eventually wear off, and then they'd start attacking the wall again. Other than this bug, however, there's just been some smaller unintended shenanigans, like troops being stuck on the wall they just jumped, troops pathing getting confused after jumping so they just go back and forth, or it breaking the stick horse equipment. It will literally remove the king's ability to jump walls, the one thing the stick horse does: revive. So much like many other bugs, this one was happening shortly after its launch. Basically, in rare occasions, when you revived a hero, it would attack for a second and then freeze until they died. They just sat there and took it all in. What nice weather outside. During the same time, there was also another bug where it didn't revive the hero at all. People were quick to say, you just dropped it wrong, bruh. But no, they were dropping it right on the hero, and you could even see the animation play at the top, but the hero would not get up. Haste. So back in early 2016, there were all sorts of bugs pertaining to Dark Elixir spells because they were still fairly new to the game. The haste was no different. There was this strange bug that caused troops to intermittently pause when going through a haste. You drop a haste for them to go faster and then they'd go a little slower. There was also another bug in 2019 where the haste would visually end, but the effects were still going on somehow. So you'd see the spell disappear, but troops suddenly getting a speed boost out of nowhere. Finally, there was another odd interaction with baby dragons. When the baby dragon was under its ability where it's raged, if you dropped a haste on it, it would actually slow down. Basically, you couldn't drop haste spells on them because the two boosts would essentially cancel each other out. This was largely the baby dragon's fault, but I still thought it was worth a mention. Freeze. In the February 2025 update, the freeze spell got a visual rework. It looked more polished and a lot more like a sheet of ice compared to before. And this rework wasn't only for when you drop the spell itself, but also when a troop dropped one like an ice golem. However, this rework came with some unintended issues. The scaling was off, so it appeared to cover an area that it actually didn't. Right off the bat, players were confused about it, but it was especially broken when an ice golem dropped one. Its radius was higher than before, but its duration was cut in half. Some players thought, what kind of terrible rework is this? But no, it wasn't a rework or just some visual glitch. The whole spell was bugged, and they ended up reverting these changes 3 days after they were implemented. I believe the intent was to fix it and put it back in, but the community wasn't really a big fan of it, at least half the community. So when they fixed some other visual changes like the fireball, the freeze didn't make it in. Healing. Okay, this spell has a pretty solid track record. I'm telling you, I looked forever and I couldn't find anything, which is unfortunate for the video, I mean, not the game. Anyway, the only thing remotely related to it was the clan capital one, where it was unintentionally healing siege carts after they were downed. But obviously, not really the heal's fault, just more of an oversight with the siege carts. Ice block. Yet another interaction that developers probably didn't think to try. Shortly after its launch, if you placed a troop, then recalled it, and then placed an ice block where the troop was just recalled from, when you redeployed the recalled troop, it would be under the ice block's effects, no matter where it was. So basically, it was wireless. The ice block was affecting troops that were previously in the radius, so you could deploy stuff all over the map with a 94% damage reduction. Nothing crazy, just a little game breaking, It also had a pretty crazy interaction with anything that was underground, I believe. It was mostly an issue with the miners where they'd come up from the ground, basically taking no damage, but also still being able to attack. Essentially, you had invincible miners. This spell is definitely up there with the most bugged spell launches of all time. Poison. So a little bit of context, back when the poison was first added, it was a common cheesy strategy to lure the clan castle and drop a poison on them, because they would just stand there until their demise. To combat this, they ended up making some changes, so now troops fled from the poison if they weren't targeting anything. Revolutionary. However, this caused some unintended quirks, like in this footage where troops would sometimes turn around mid-attack to get away from the poison. Like they were actively trying to get out of the poison, but also remember, wait a minute, we're supposed to be defending the village. Now, I know it can be a little hard to make out what exactly is going on in this low-quality footage, but sometimes bugs and glitches aren't well documented, and so this is all we have to show it in action. Recall. The most devastating bug I could find about the recall was a rare one where you would recall troops and then you drop them somewhere else, but suddenly some of those troops would respawn back to where you originally recalled them from. So in this footage, you see a Dragon Rider pop into existence when the spell is dropped elsewhere, which is where all the other troops are, minus the one Dragon Rider. It was also pretty broken during the re-engagement phase, which is when you're inactive for a while and come back to attack your own village type thing. Any recall spell that was given to you as a reinforcement were not able to be redeployed. You'd simply recall the troops and they were gone. However, they did eventually implement a hotfix where it doesn't give you any more recalls. Other than these two bugs, I could only find some visual glitches, but nothing crazy. Overgrowth. This was also a pretty crazy one. So in September 2024, the Overgrowth received a nerf to its duration and radius. Nothing out of the ordinary as far as nerfs go, but in the game, it seems they forgot to change some values around, because footage like this started to float around. It seemed like buildings previously under an Overgrowth were immune to all damage. What had happened was that after the spell had wore out, let's say it went on for 25 seconds, the animation would play, but the buildings were still under the spell, if you know what I mean, for 28 seconds, the pre-nerf duration. Someone had messed up, and it seems they had only nerfed the duration that the vines were up, rather than the spell's effects. It was pretty devastating for Fireball and Sparky Ball strategies, but yeah, skill issue. Totem. So because the totem itself is a troop, naturally most of the bugs involved interactions with other troops. For example, troops will sometimes get stuck on it, unable to get around it, and it not working properly with guardians and heroes. You drop it and expect them to get stunned and retargeted, but that didn't happen. They'd ignore it. This seemed to only happen when the totem was dropped while they were jumping, so a little rare, I guess, but probably the most busted interaction wasn't with a troop, but a building. The air sweeper. Somehow the totem's stun would cause the air sweepers to retarget as normal, but then its shots would affect ground troops. Yeah, you'd see them walking and suddenly get pushed back by air. Now, this was most likely a bug caused by the fact that the totem is a ground troop, and so when the air sweeper was forced to target the totem, a ground troop, it would also affect other ground troops in the area. I think the Totem Spell certainly had the buggiest spell launch. There's tons of other strange interactions, but those were the most interesting. Bat Spell. As you may know, the bats spawned from the Bat Spell deal decreased damage to resource buildings, including storages in the Town Hall. This was already the case when it launched, and it was working perfectly fine, unless the bats were cloned. Whoops, I forgot to test that one before releasing it. Now, I'm not a game developer to know which spell was at fault here, but it was certainly one of the most hilarious spell launches. People would bring tons of bat spells and a clone, and it would shred through bases. And the bat spells were already OP as they were. This only added fuel to the flames. Anyway, it took 6 months to be fixed. I'm not sure why it took so long, but yeah. Rage. Nothing crazy for this spell, just some visual shenanigans here and there, like invisible rage spells in 2015. You would see the troops being raged, but the spell was nowhere to be seen. There was also this one stat error back in the day where it said it would boost troops by 30%, when in reality it was supposed to say 130%. But of course, it was eventually changed to display the correct amounts. And finally, in 2013, after the lab got a UI refresh, the rage was accidentally labeled as a Haste Spell, which is actually its code name. So it looks like someone just typed it in wrong or something. It was pretty crazy though, because years later, a Haste Spell would actually come out. Earthquake. So there's a couple from early 2016 that I wanted to look at. The first is that the battle would prematurely end even if you had an earthquake that could destroy like a town hall for an extra star or the very last building before 100%. Now, this was actually a problem that the lightning spell had for nearly a year after its launch. However, it was fixed. But because the earthquake was still fairly new, the issue came back to shake the meta. Okay, that was terrible. There was also a glitch, not specific to the earthquake, that allowed receiving an extra Dark Elixir spell, and so it was possible to only bring 3 earthquakes to destroy walls, but actually 4 would drop. This may or may not have been caused by another bug affecting Dark Elixir spells in general, where if you left the clan, the spell in your clan castle was bugged. Sometimes if you tried to attack, your game would straight out crash, or the spell would disappear. So yeah, the earthquake, as well as basically every other Dark Elixir spell, had a pretty rocky start. Clone. So this bug, conveniently, was happening during the time when blizzard attacks were just taking off. Players were noticing that if you clone troops inside an invisibility, they would not only pool clan castle troops, but also be targeted by defenses for a brief moment, which sometimes was more than enough time for like a mortar or a scatter shot to blast them into infinity. Now, there were a lot of issues here at play. I'm gonna be careful not to point any fingers. It could have been the clone, it could have been the invisibility, it could have been the troops, it could have been the defenses. They were all guilty. But yeah, during this time, cloning certain troops inside an invisibility was pretty risky, and it took like a year to fix the issue. Invisibility. As we saw, clone troops inside an invisibility would sometimes be targeted by a defense and pool CC troops, but it didn't always involve a clone spell. There was another bug where troops under an invisibility would get blasted by a scatter shot. Now, I know it's easy to assume that this had nothing to do with the spell, it was a scatter shot. But no, it was both the defense's retargeting mechanics and the way the spell makes troops invisible. This one was eventually fixed, and it is often still confused even to this day for poor timing. So if you experience this today, chances are it's a skill issue. Nah, but seriously, it was patched. Skeleton Spell. I didn't find much for the skeleton spell. I mean, back in the day, it was believed that the skeletons had a bug where they did almost no damage to town halls, and many players did their own investigating. But it turned out it was just some hidden mechanic that Supercell forgot to tell us. Whoops, sorry guys, yeah, don't use those on town halls. The Clan Capital version though, there was a small bug where if the spell was dropped and all other troops died, the battle would end. You know, if you know anything about the spell there, it requires troops to die to work. Obviously, not very cash money. The skeletons could have done some damage, but no, lightning. In 2015, many videos of lightning spells leaving air defenses with low HP were being shared. At first glance, it may seem like a literal skill issue, for real this time. You know, because back in the day, you needed to place it exactly in the center, within millimeters and all that jazz. However, it wasn't like that. It only needed to be roughly in the middle. And you just had to make sure your lightning was of the appropriate level for the air defense you were taking on. It wasn't that deep, which is why people were confused why air defenses were still standing with what seemed like 1 HP. It's as if the spell wasn't dealing enough damage or not hitting it where it was supposed to. These mechanics were so confusing and buggy that they eventually reworked the lightning into a single bolt. Aside from that though, there isn't much for this spell. The Clan Capital version showed that it would deal an insane amount of damage, but it obviously wasn't. I just thought it was a funny visual bug. But yeah, that is one bug or glitch for every spell in Clash of Clans. I went down some crazy rabbit holes to find some of these, but I'm glad to have found one for each, even if it was its Clan Capital counterpart. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed, but hey, YouTube thinks you'll like this next video, so why don't you check it out? As always, thanks for watching, and have a good one out. Peace!